In the winter of 1847, 17 young women arrived at the isolated St. Margaret's Convent in the hills of western Pennsylvania, ready to dedicate their lives to God. But by spring, only 3 of them were still alive, and none of them ever spoke about what happened during those long, cold months. The Catholic Church kept the official record sealed for over 100 years, but recently uncovered letters from one of the surviving nuns reveal a truth so disturbing. It forces us to question everything we thought we knew about devotion, suffering, and the limits of human belief. What happened inside those walls that drove 14 women to their deaths? And why did the Church work so hard to make sure no one ever found out? The answer lies in first-hand accounts that even seasoned Church investigators found too unsettling to make public. Tonight, we look into the case of the nuns who never made it to their final vows. Before we continue, just a quick reminder, this channel is for those who are willing to face the darker parts of history, the stories that many prefer to forget. If that sounds like you, go ahead and hit subscribe and turn on notifications. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always incredible to see how far these stories reach. Now, let's go back to 1847, into the remote hills of Pennsylvania, and uncover the truth about what really happened at St. Margaret's Convent. This story takes place in a time when America was still shaping its religious identity. The Catholic Church was struggling to gain a foothold in a predominantly Protestant country, and 1847 was a pivotal year. Thousands of Irish immigrants fleeing the Great Famine were arriving in the U.S., and the Church was trying to meet their growing needs for spiritual guidance and community. Pennsylvania, thanks to its history of religious tolerance under the Quakers, had become a haven for Catholic institutions, but that didn't mean acceptance came easily. Protestant communities were deeply suspicious of Catholic convents, often accusing them of hiding secret rituals or forcing young women into religious life. Against their will. In western Pennsylvania, where Protestant settlers had lived for generations, hostility toward Catholics ran especially high. Newspapers fueled public fear with stories of imprisoned nuns and hidden abuses. A political group known as the Know Nothing Party gained traction by campaigning against Catholic influence in public life. Against this tense backdrop stood St. Margaret's Convent, about 30 miles southeast of Pittsburgh. Built in 1832 by German stoneworkers, the convent was a towering stone structure, 3 stories tall, with narrow Gothic windows and a pointed bell tower reaching toward the sky. The building was designed to intimidate and inspire awe. Inside, it was cold, dimly lit, and silent, more fortress than sanctuary. The convent was home to the Sisters of Divine Mercy, a rigid religious order recently brought over from France. Unlike other Catholic sisters who ran schools or hospitals, this order focused entirely on spiritual purification through suffering. Their recruitment criteria were strict: only unmarried women between 18 and 25, and only those with strong faith and physical stamina. The convent was led by Mother Superior Agatha Russo, a woman in her early 50s with the commanding presence of European nobility. She spoke heavily accented English and often seemed to know what others were thinking before they said a word. She claimed to have served in several European convents and had arrived in America during the political unrest of the 1830s. Her references, when requested by Bishop Patrick O'Malley, were vague at best. What was undeniable was her deep knowledge of Catholic teachings and her firm belief that the Church had grown too lenient. She was determined to restore old traditions, ones rooted in discipline and spiritual pain. Life at the convent was strict. The sisters woke at 4 a.m. to pray, walking barefoot across freezing stone floors to the chapel. Breakfast was watery, porridge and stale bread, eaten in silence while Mother Agatha read aloud from obscure religious texts. Days were filled with prayer, manual labor, and studying manuscripts written in Latin and French. Talking was limited to only what was necessary. Laughing was punished. For the novices, young women still preparing to take final vows, the rules were even harsher. They were expected to prove their worth through extreme fasting, physical discomfort, and the confession of even the smallest doubts. One of them was Sister Catherine Murphy, a 21-year-old from Philadelphia who had joined the convent in the fall of 1846. She came from a working-class Irish immigrant family and had always admired the charitable sisters who ran clinics in her neighborhood. Inspired by their example, she sought a life of service. But the atmosphere at St. Margaret's was nothing like the warmth and kindness she had known in the city. Years later, letters Catherine had written to her family were discovered in an old trunk in the attic. In them, she described a community that valued obedience over compassion and hinted at something far more disturbing happening beneath the surface. The winter of 1847 was unusually harsh in Pennsylvania. Snow started falling in November and didn't let up until March. Drifts piled up so high they reached the convent's second-story windows. For months, the convent was completely cut off. Even their only outside contact, an elderly priest named Father Hinrich Metz, stopped visiting when the roads became impassable. Food was already scarce by design, and by January, the root cellar was nearly empty. But Mother Agatha refused to scale back the physical work. Instead, she insisted that increased hardship was spiritually necessary. That December, she announced that the sisters would undergo a special test of faith, one meant to separate the truly devout from those merely curious. She spoke of forgotten traditions and lost practices, and how those who passed the test would reach a higher level of spiritual understanding. On the night of December 13th, Catherine was awakened not by the morning bell, but by the sound of her roommate crying softly in the dark. Sister Mary Agnes O'Brien was just 19 and had only joined the convent 2 months earlier. "They're taking us to the chapel," she whispered, shaking, "one by one. And some of us, they don't come back the same," she said. Sister Elizabeth had returned days earlier, but wasn't herself anymore. She didn't speak, ate differently, and once Catherine saw her drinking something dark from a cup handed to her by Mother Agatha. Her eyes, Mary Agnes whispered, "They don't look right anymore." The chapel itself wasn't like others Catherine had seen. It was carved directly into the rock beneath the convent, a cold, damp cavern filled with flickering candlelight. The walls wept moisture, and the shadows created moving patterns that played tricks on the eyes. Etched into the stone were symbols that weren't Christian, at least not any version Catherine had ever studied. Spirals, sharp geometric designs, and twisted human shapes that were hard to look at directly. Mother Agatha insisted they were symbols from the early church, but Catherine, who had studied church history, wasn't convinced. At the center was an altar carved into the floor, a round pit surrounded by grooves that disappeared into the dark. It looked more like something used for ancient rituals than Christian worship. The stone was stained with something dark and long absorbed, and the air around it felt heavy. That night, round midnight, Mother Agatha appeared with 2 senior sisters. Their faces were fully veiled. They carried candles that gave off a strange bluish-white glow that distorted shadows. "Sister Mary Agnes," Mother Agatha said quietly, "it is time for your private examination of faith." Catherine watched helplessly as her roommate was led away. Mary Agnes turned once, her eyes filled with fear. Catherine read her lips as she mouthed 2 words, "Help me." Then the door closed behind them. Catherine stayed up the rest of the night, listening for any sound. Nothing. Even the chapel windows had been covered. The only light came from a faint glow that seemed to leak from the building's stone foundation. Just before dawn, she heard footsteps approaching. Slower than usual, Mary Agnes returned, but something about her had changed. Her walk was too smooth, her expression blank. She didn't say a word when she looked at Catherine. Her eyes reflected the light like an animal's. Catherine barely recognized her. Mary Agnes lay down in bed, fully dressed, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, and didn't move until the morning bell rang. That they were being watched more closely. The senior sisters, once indifferent to the novices' movements, now seemed to appear in doorways without warning, linger near conversations that had no reason to interest them, and change routines without explanation. Catherine began to suspect that someone, maybe more than one, had begun to sense their growing awareness. Small privileges were taken away, cleaning assignments were shuffled, group prayers shortened, work rotations became more isolated. Even the few moments they had to speak in passing were now monitored. The sense of surveillance was constant. It was clear someone had noticed the shift, even if they didn't yet know how much. The girls had uncovered Still, the five persisted. Each night, they met in different locations: the pantry, the laundry room, even the cold storage cellar, sharing findings in whispers and jotting notes in hidden ledgers. Clara used her access as secretary to quietly remove pages from duplicate records, storing them behind loose stones in the basement. Margaret collected small samples of the strange red liquid left behind in the chapel and sealed them in glass bottles hidden under floorboards. Catherine began leaving false notes in her journal to throw off any reader, and Rose recorded everything they observed in coded phrases scratched into wood panels and the backs of worn hymnals. They knew they had limited time, and they needed to preserve everything in case only one of them managed to escape. By mid-February, the snow had started to melt just enough to make escape a possibility. But now they faced a new threat. Sister Clara had gone missing. She hadn't been called for a midnight examination. She hadn't shown any signs of distress. One morning, she simply didn't return to her cell. Mother Agatha claimed that Clara had been transferred to a convent in Ohio to assist with administrative duties, chosen for her strong literacy skills. But Catherine knew that wasn't true. Clara's winter coat, boots, and writing case were still under her bed. The loss hit the group hard. Without Clara's access to records, they were cut off from crucial information. Worse, the silence surrounding her disappearance sent a chilling message. The transformation could begin at any time, without warning and without ritual. The remaining for novices Catherine, Margaret, and Rose doubled their efforts. They planned to leave on the next moonless night, using a tunnel beneath the root cellar that Margaret had confirmed led to the woods. It wasn't a path meant for people, but it was their only option. Their final night at St. Margaret's was marked by a stillness more suffocating than usual. No wind, no footsteps, no prayers, just silence. When the bell struck midnight, they were already slipping through the floor hatch. Margaret led the way, her lantern dimmed and wrapped in cloth, and followed, then Catherine, then Rose. They moved quickly through the cramped tunnel, crawling through mud and ice, guided only by the faint slope they prayed would lead them out. Behind them, the convent remained dark until, suddenly, the chapel lit up with that eerie bluish-white glow, the same cold light Catherine had seen on the night Mary Agnes was taken. The chanting started again, soft at first, then rising, echoing down through the earth. Then they heard it, a voice, not from behind them, but from within the tunnel, going somewhere. "My children." The voice was calm, familiar. Catherine turned and saw nothing but darkness. Then came the sound of movement, fluid, deliberate. Faster than anyone could crawl, Margaret pushed forward, hissing for them to move faster, and began to panic, her breath quick and shallow. Rose clutched the lantern tight, holding it back like a shield. And then, just ahead, fresh air. Catherine could feel it on her face. She pushed in forward and grabbed Rose by the arm. Together, they emerged from the earth and into the freezing night. They didn't stop to look back. They ran, for hours, through trees, across frozen streams, through thickets that tore their clothes and cut their skin. Only when the sky began to lighten did they slow. They made it to the edge of a small mining town just after dawn. Exhausted, filthy, and nearly frozen, they pounded on the door of the town's tiny church, begging to speak to a priest. The man who answered was young and confused but kind. He took them in, fed them, let them rest. But when they told their story, he didn't believe them. He assumed they were traumatized runaways, possibly delusional, maybe even dangerous. The local sheriff was called. A doctor examined them. The girls gave their names and insisted that an investigation be launched into St. Margaret's convent. But by the time law enforcement arrived at the site, the convent was gone. Not just empty, gone. The stone structure had burned to the ground in what officials called a freak lightning fire during a storm 2 days after the girls fled. There were no survivors, no remains, no records. To this day, nothing about the convent remains, not on church maps, not in official diocesan records, not even in the archives of Westmoreland County. The girls were placed in different facilities across the state. Their claims were dismissed as hallucinations born of exposure and stress. They were warned not to speak of their experiences. Only Catherine's letters and notes hidden in books, tucked behind pages of old Bibles, and eventually mailed anonymously. Survived. She lived quietly after that, working in a rural parish school in Ohio, never taking vows, never returning to religious life. Mary Agnes's message carved into the stone remained burned into her memory. They are not what they seem. Trust no one especially. Those who return changed. And so, the story of St. Margaret's Convent faded into obscurity. Just another lost piece of forgotten history. But some say, on certain winter nights, when the snow drifts are high and the air is still, the wind through the Pennsylvania hills sounds strangely like chanting, and the trees whisper names that have long since vanished from memory. ChatGPT said, ears as if the sound caused them physical pain. Their movements became erratic, as if some unseen force was unraveling their control from the inside out. The cups hit the stone floor and shattered, the thick liquid spilling and seeping into the cracks between the flagstones. Mother Agatha shrieked, her voice no longer human. Who dares interrupt the sacred rite? She bellowed, staggering backward as if the sound itself was pushing her away from the group. Catherine didn't wait. She grabbed Anne's arm and pulled her toward the far end of the storage room, where a small supply hatch led to the root cellar. Margaret followed, helping Rose along as the others ducked through the narrow opening. Clara brought up the rear, glancing over her shoulder as the senior sisters writhed under the weight of the ringing. They moved quickly, the five of them stumbling through the cold and dark, hearts pounding. The bell continued to ring clear, unwavering, almost otherworldly. Catherine had no idea where it was coming from, but in that moment, she didn't care. All that mattered was that it had bought them a few precious minutes to escape outside. The snow had begun to fall again, but the storm had eased. The moonless sky made it hard to see, but the ringing guided them like a distant beacon calling them towards safety. They didn't speak. They didn't look back. They just ran later. None of them could say for sure how far they traveled or how long it took. Eventually, they stumbled onto a logging road and flagged down a passing cart just before dawn. The driver, startled by their condition but kind, took them to the nearest town. From there, the girls were taken in, fed, and questioned. When the local authorities returned to the convent, they found it empty, abandoned, as if no one had lived there in months. The chapel, the dormitory, the hidden chambers, everything had been stripped clean. No bodies, no signs of struggle, just silence. The church bells that had saved them, no one in the nearby towns reported hearing them, according to local records. The bell tower at St. Margaret's hadn't been operational for decades. Catherine and the others never got a full explanation. Their story was quietly dismissed, their experiences chalked up to trauma and religious hysteria. But privately, they stayed in touch, each carrying with them pieces of what they'd seen, what they'd survived. They knew what they had witnessed hadn't been imagined. They knew something ancient had lived in those halls, hidden behind the mask of faith, and though they had escaped, the question lingered. How many more places like St. Margaret's were still out there, still hiding, still waiting? They clutched their heads in agony, reacting to the bells as if the sound itself were tearing them apart. At first, Catherine thought it might be divine intervention, but the truth, she would later learn, was even more disturbing because it was real. The bells came from a rescue party led by Bishop Patrick O'Malley himself. He hadn't been alerted by any of the novices' letters. Instead, it was Father Hinrich Metz, the elderly German priest, who raised the alarm. Growing uneasy over the prolonged silence from St. Margaret's and the harsh winter conditions, Father Metz made the difficult journey to the convent once the weather cleared in early March. What he found shook him deeply. He'd arrived unexpectedly in the night and witnessed the senior sisters performing a ritual in the basement chapel over the body of a novice who was supposed to have been transferred to another convent. That was enough. He rode straight to Pittsburgh and reported everything to the bishop. But Father Metz wasn't just a concerned local priest. He belonged to a covert branch within the Catholic Church, an old order formed specifically to detect and root out the kind of dark infiltration that had taken hold at St. Margaret's. The Church had long been aware that certain entities found cover within religious institutions, and over centuries, it had developed strategies for identifying and confronting them. Bishop O'Malley and his team came equipped with more than just clerical authority. The bells they carried had been blessed and inscribed with prayers in ancient Latin, designed to disrupt the kind of unnatural forces sustaining the transformed sisters. As the sound echoed through the convent, the creatures' disguised forms began to fall apart. The collapse was grotesque. Their true shapes were unstable, flickering between shadows and something barely solid. Mother Agatha held her form longer than the others, but even she couldn't withstand the onslaught. As her human mask crumbled, her real form was revealed, something once human, but twisted by centuries of feeding on life energy. "You think you've won?" she snarled as the bishop and his team entered the storage room, their silver crosses raised. "You know nothing about what we are. We've lived inside your churches for 1,000 years and will live for 1,000 more. For every nest you burn, more will rise. Your faith is the perfect mask, your believers, the perfect source." Bishop O'Malley was unfazed. "You're not eternal, and you're not unique," he said firmly, lifting a cross that seemed to glow from within. "You're parasites. You feed on the faith of others because you have none of your own. The church has faced your kind before and it will again, but your time here is over." He began to chant, not just Latin prayers, but something older, an interwoven litany designed to strip away whatever force had been keeping her alive. The results were immediate. Mother Agatha started to decay in front of them, aging rapidly as the power sustaining her broke down. "The sacred substance," she gasped, her voice barely a whisper. "Without it, we can't hold our form. You must understand, we only took what was freely given. These girls came to us. They sought purpose. We offered them more than your God ever could. You took their lives," Bishop O'Malley replied. "You twisted their faith and consumed their spirits. What you did here wasn't sacred. It was theft, and it ends now." As he continued his prayers, Mother Agatha collapsed inward, her unnatural body unraveling like fabric. Just before the end, she turned toward the girls. "We were human once," she said weakly. "We came here just like you, looking for purpose. But we found something older than your Christ. We thought we'd chosen life. Instead, we chose hunger. Don't remember us as monsters. Remember us as a warning." Then she crumbled to dust. The other sisters had already dissolved under the weight of the bells and prayers. The storage room was silent except for the muffled sobs of the 5 surviving novices and the faint sound of bells still ringing outside. But the nightmare wasn't over. As the rescue team helped the survivors, they made a terrible discovery. Several novices who had undergone partial transformation were still alive. They were caught in a limbo, not fully human, but not yet entirely consumed. They knew what had happened to them, and they begged to be released. They couldn't survive without the sacred substance, and taking more would complete their transformation. The bishop faced a terrible decision: let them suffer a slow decline, or offer them a peaceful death. In the end, he chose mercy. He gave them final blessings, and then helped release them from their suffering. What happened at St. Margaret's was both a victory and a tragedy. Of the 17 novices who had entered the convent, only 5 remained human: Catherine, Margaret, and Rose, and Clara. The others were either consumed, transformed beyond saving, or given mercy before it was too late. Bishop O'Malley ordered a full investigation. The convent was dismantled stone by stone. What the team found confirmed their worst fears: hidden rooms filled with the remains of dozens of girls, ritual tools with no connection to Christian practices, and documents revealing a broader network of similar operations. Throughout North America and Europe, the church issued a public explanation. The convent had closed due to administrative problems and irregular credentials, but the real findings were sealed in Vatican archives, inaccessible to the public. The church had long learned that exposing such truths would only harm the faith of its followers. Without solving the deeper problem, the land was cleansed, prayed over, and left to return to nature. Locals reported strange occurrences for years: lights, voices, feelings of unease, but over time, the forest reclaimed the site, and the stories faded. Catherine left the church, but not her faith. She married Thomas Sullivan, a doctor who had been part of the rescue mission. They raised 6 children, and she lived a long life. She never spoke publicly about what happened, but after her death in 1940, her great-granddaughter discovered letters in the attic. They describe the events at St. Margaret's in vivid detail. At first, the letters were dismissed as delusions, but church historians later confirmed their accuracy, matching sealed reports that had never been made public. Margaret became a doctor and spent her life treating the poor. She never married. She died in 1901 while helping victims of a cholera outbreak, and returned to Ireland, helped raise orphan children, and died young, likely never fully recovering from what she experienced. Rose taught in Boston, raised 2 children, and struggled with nightmares until her death in 1889. Clara became a journalist, exposing corruption in religious institutions across New England. She never married, dedicating her life to truth-telling. The 5 women stayed in touch until the end. They developed a coded system to warn each other about other suspect institutions. Their letters, now preserved by their descendants, reveal women forever changed but determined to protect others. While they never encountered anything as extreme again, their efforts helped shut down several religious institutions that were abusing young people under the guise of spiritual care. As investigators pieced together the larger pattern, it became clear that Mother Agatha, or whatever she truly was, had operated in several countries under different names. The corruption wasn't isolated. It had deep roots, stretching back centuries. Bishop O'Malley's personal notes, released decades later, showed that 12 more institutions had been shut down. After St. Margaret's, the bishop spent the rest of his life developing protocols and training others to recognize the signs. His secret department operated quietly well into the 20th century. The church was forced to confront how the very qualities that made religious life so appealing, devotion, obedience, sacrifice, also made it vulnerable to abuse. New oversight procedures were introduced, but always behind closed doors. Public trust, they believed, depended on silence. Catherine's final letter, written before her death, offered a stark warning. The enemy of faith is not disbelief, it's false faith. Evil doesn't always arrive looking like evil. Sometimes it dresses like holiness, speaks the language of salvation, and builds sanctuaries that look like houses of God. Trust in God, but question those who claim to speak for Him without question. Be careful around institutions that demand total isolation or discourage independent thought. Wolves have learned how to dress like shepherds, and they're always hungry. The story of St. Margaret's Convent is a chilling reminder of how easily good intentions can be twisted. It shows how faith can be manipulated and how institutions meant to protect the vulnerable can become places of harm. But it also reminds us that fighting this kind of evil takes more than prayer. It takes courage, knowledge, and a willingness to act. The battle isn't just spiritual, it's practical. So what do you think? Do you believe the full truth about St. Margaret's was ever revealed? Could other institutions still be hiding similar secrets? Have you ever had a strange feeling about a religious group you couldn't explain? Let us know in the comments. Share this video if you want more deep dive mysteries like this one. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us as we continue uncovering the darker corners of forgotten history. Sometimes the stories we aren't supposed to hear are the ones we need the most.